Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much to the Academy for the invitation to talk to you today. Thank you to all the speakers. It's been a fascinating day. I've really enjoyed it, and slightly humbling to be in the presence of so many distinguished engineers. I am not one of those, so forgive me, my presentation is not very technical. But I will focus on talking to you a bit about Gatwick, a bit about what our challenges are, common to many airports, I suspect, and where we see in relation to those challenges, where there's a big opportunity for AI, both now and in the future. We're probably at a stage where there's a lot of opportunity. We've got a lot of things in trial. So what I'm talking about are a lot of opportunities for the future, but let me take you through it. So some facts and figures about Gatwick. As Pierre said, it's a busy place. So in the 12 months to September, which is when this slide was put together, we did just under 43 million passengers. 2023 full year, I think we were the 8th busiest airport in Europe. Primarily short haul, but there's quite a nice smattering of long haul as well. 55 airlines, 225 destinations. So it's a big and really interesting mix, both of airlines and therefore, of course, of passengers. So it's a busy place, but then lots of airports are busy. But the interesting thing about Gatwick is that that busyness is handled from a very small footprint in terms of infrastructure. So we have one active runway. That runway frequently, at peak, runs over 900 air traffic movements per day. And to achieve that, because we have a night curfew, so to achieve that, we're regularly hitting 55 and sometimes slightly above movements per hour. I believe that there is no other airport in the world that achieves that. Look at the campus size. It's pretty small. I've put a couple of other airports there for reference. Heathrow is obviously much bigger, but Munich and Rome run about the same passenger numbers as Gatwick. They're much bigger. They have more runways. So that gives us a very complicated and often quite challenging ground operation because we have to get 900 movements per day. We have to feed that runway with aeroplanes constantly. And just maneuvering them all around this compressed space that we have can be quite challenging. But of course, also we need to get people and bags to and from the planes. We only have 2 terminals. So those are pretty busy places as well. So we're regularly hitting up to 5,000 passengers an hour through security, through both terminals. We've raised kind of high volume security screening to a bit of an art form. And I hope if anybody who goes through Gatwick, it can be a bit busy, but it's usually pretty quick. And we absolutely pride ourselves in the ability to process our passengers quickly and safely. So I think that sets some of the context around the challenges that we look to technology and increasingly to AI to address. And so the next slide, I'm just going to sort of summarize some of the main focuses of the business and the operation. So in such a busy place, performance is critical and really challenging. By performance, really we mean punctuality, specifically on-time departure is a massive thing for an airport, for airlines as well, of course. It's difficult because we have a lot of short haul, as I say. We have regularly numerous aircraft who are doing 3, sometimes 4 rotations in the day. Our short haul carriers are often aiming for a minimum turn time of about 40 minutes. So that's on box or on chocks and off chocks again, 40 minutes. There's a lot to get done in 40 minutes. And to do that over and over again, sometimes hundreds of times a day in order to meet the schedule is incredibly challenging. There's a whole lot that has to go right to make that happen. And what that means is there's a whole lot that can go wrong in the same way. Loads of stakeholders involved in that process. Of course, there's airlines, there's crew, there's ground handlers, there's baggage handlers. The airport has to get people with bags to the plane. We've got to get refueling done. Buses sometimes all turning up at the right time to do the right thing. And then once the pilot has called up ready to go, well, then the tower has to then get him off stand onto the runway and into the sky. And sometimes there's a hold up there because managing that traffic on the ground can be difficult as well. So we have, in some places, pretty good data on how that process works. So laser-guided stand entry guidance systems, for example. So we know to the millisecond pretty much when an aircraft arrives on stand, pretty much to the millisecond when it leaves. So we kind of know what that turn time is. If that turn time is too long or there's a delay, we kind of know. But what goes on during that 40, 50, 60-minute period can be a bit of a dark space. It's a bit murky because our amount of understanding and granular understanding of what goes on in that period uh, can be quite difficult. And one of the things we're very interested in is, can we deploy AI to allow us to understand much more about what's going on in that space? Um, Another aspect, a dimension of performance, is the ability to consistently hit those targets. And of course, as we all know, anyone who's had anything to do with airport operations knows that every day you start with a plan, and the plan looks good. And as the great philosopher Mike Tyson once said, everybody has a plan until they're punched in the face. And normally, by about, we start about 0200 in the morning, the plan looks good. By about 0230, something's gone wrong. A plane's gone tag, or the crew are stuck in traffic, or there's regulation in Europe. So the plan is being constantly adjusted. And the better we are at dynamically reworking that plan in response to the various different constraints we have, the more likely it is that we can carry on and run a good schedule. But there are so many moving parts. I think it's the phrase someone else moved. It's almost beyond the power of a single human brain to be able to understand all those moving parts and make the best decisions in response to disruption in the course of a busy day. So in the ideal world, we would start building a system, and we're looking at this, that takes in indicators and metrics and KPIs from all over the operation, continuously calculates what is the best set of decisions that need to be made to get us back on track and to preserve the schedule as best we can. Flip side of performance, also capacity. As you've seen, it's a very constrained airport. We've actually got an ambition to grow. Actually, we believe we can grow even in the current footprint. We do actually have the potential to we have a standby runway to bring that potentially into regular use towards the end of the decade. But even in the next 5 years, we believe we can grow. But that means making absolutely the best use as we can of our existing fixed assets. So in check-in, in security, stand allocation. An important role here is the ability to predict what passenger presentation is going to be like. Again, as schedules start to shift during the day, what is the best way of using our fixed assets to make sure we absolutely maximize the throughput that we can for our passengers. And being able to start to use machine learning and intelligent data models to understand what the picture is going to look like in a few hours' time, tomorrow, next week, makes that much more possible. The other thing we've seen since COVID, actually, which has made this a bit more challenging, is that what happened to Gatwick during COVID is a number of our big airlines consolidated back to Heathrow. It just wasn't practical for them to operate out of both. So particularly in long haul, that's left us with a gap. So the airline development team have been busy jetting around the world, encouraging additional airlines to come to Gatwick, which has been very successful. But it now means we have a much broader mix, which is great in many ways. But actually, a slightly unexpected knock-on of that is we've lost some economies of scale. If you've got a big carrier like, for example, Virgin Atlantic, who operated at Gatwick pre-COVID, we just allocate them a big check-in area, a big load of the baggage hall, and we just let them manage it themselves. Now, with a lot of airlines who are operating much less frequently, the ability or the challenge of allocating those resources across a much broader set of airlines becomes much more difficult, and obviously a much more opportunity for technology and artificial intelligence to make that a lot more easier. Productivity, and by that I mean really the productivity of our human employees at the airport. Again, post-COVID, very similar to, I'm sure, to many aviation organizations. We restructured, we shrunk down. We're a much leaner organization coming out of COVID. So big imperative on IT, technology, AI, particularly generative AI, to get absolutely the maximum productivity we can out of our workforce. And that's a big driver for us. And underlying all of that is, of course, sustainability. As we know, one of the key challenges for the aviation industry now in the next decade or two, we need to burn less carbon. Now, a lot of this actually aligns very nicely. If we're operating aircraft more efficiently, burning less fuel, that's great. If we're using our fixed resources more efficiently, consuming less electricity, that's great. We're starting to track passengers around the airport much more effectively with the intention of deploying heat, cooling, lighting, in a much more targeted way to where those passengers are, rather than a slightly broad brush approach. Looking at, for example, how do we operate our vehicles around the estate? Can we build intelligent models that let us optimize how many miles the vehicles do, whether they're burning petrol or increasing in the future, burning electrons? So lots of opportunity for AI in that space. So how do we think about AI? And I think, as we've heard a lot about today, AI is not a single thing. It's a huge spectrum of technology, a huge amount of different use cases. And in terms of adoption and how do we get it used and embedded in the organization, that means there's different ways of thinking about that. And I've stolen these ideas a bit from Gartner, I have to say. And they've distinguished, but I think it's useful. It sort of works in my head to distinguish between what you might call everyday AI, which is suddenly exploded on us because of Gen AI, because of ChatGPT, because of Copilot. This is now everywhere, whether we wanted it or asked for it or not. It's just appeared. People in the business, all over the business, are now using it. If you're Microsoft users like we are, Copilot has just appeared everywhere. So it's just happened. I don't think that's a bad thing, but it does bring with it a whole set of risks that we need to manage and to understand how we make the best of it. Because what you've got are a whole lot of very useful use cases, but none of them by themselves are very transformational, I would say. However, if you have everybody in your organization starting to use those, if it's 500, 1,000, 2,000 people, then suddenly all those small use cases put together actually start to become quite transformational. So there, the challenge and the opportunity is probably around adoption, and we'll talk about that in a second. But then the other end of the scale, big stuff, transformational AI. For example, this big model, a sort of total airport management model we would like to build of the airport, which will allow us to program our resources, replan in real time. That is a big transformational thing, much more like a more traditional IT project. Actually, we're kind of more used to doing that. But there's a bit, and of course, there's a broad spectrum in between. So just talking a bit about that everyday AI and the adoption challenge, and I guess getting the business, and as the chief technologist, I suppose, at Gatwick, I think of it as part of my role to bring the business on a journey, to introduce technology, to coach the business into how to adopt it, to get the most out of it. But what we have now, of course, is a huge range of generations in the business. Probably, I think, in terms of variety, the widest ever. Before I came out here, I chatted to HR about what was the longest serving person at Gatwick. That person joined the company in 1975. They were born in 1956. Growing up, to them, cool tech, black and white telly. At the other end of the spectrum, we run an apprentice scheme. I have 16-year-olds in my department who were born in 2008, which is slightly alarming. I think they were in the womb with the smartphone. It's natural. It's like breathing to them. And as one example that always occurs to me is when TikTok hit the streets a few years ago. I've got teenage children, and what I don't think happened was my children came to me and said, "Dad, this TikTok application has appeared. We're a bit worried about it. What's the family policy on the safe use of TikTok? Do you have a manual that I can read from cover to cover before I start using it?" That did not happen. They went, "Cool, let's go." And that's Gen Z, and they're all over it. Now, that is not going to happen for my guy who's joined the company in 1975 and has been there ever since. So I think the challenge about adoption and generally bringing IT and technology closer to the organization, which generative AI gives you a fantastic opportunity to do, is to have this really sort of nuanced strategy around adoption. Some people will want guidelines and manuals. That's completely fine. But other people will want freedom, but they need to understand that there is accountability that goes with that freedom. So we're running or building a kind of cultural program, which is around digital leadership, where we're finding people in the business who can be ambassadors for technology, but AI in particular. And we can coach them in the good uses of it, what are the dangers, and then slowly spread this knowledge throughout the business as a result. So we're talking about challenges. We talked a bit about adoption. I think it's very important. Of course, as everybody says, as we talked about, the risks, governance is really crucial. So in that box sits risk as well. And we've had several false starts at this. We tried writing policies. We got lawyers involved. It got very rigid and very structured. And we started saying things like, you must do this. You can use AI for these things, but not these things. Eventually, we gave up. This is not right. And actually, what we've done instead is incorporate that into a wider program, which we're calling standards of behavior. which primarily is about safeguarding. There's a lot of course, safety and security is massive at an airport. So we talk a lot about safeguarding our passengers, but actually we've now started to bring in safeguarding our data and our privacy into that same conversation, and starting to build that culture of understanding how important data is and actually what the risks are around AI associated with it. We're doing some more concrete things as well, around sort of data governance and information governance management. Because in the old days of about 2 years ago, if the business wanted data, they probably had to come to IT. We'd go and get it, we'd clean it, we'd sanitize it, we'd give it back to them with a bow around it. A few months would have gone by, mind you, and they'd probably decided they didn't need it by that point. But at least it was safe. Now, of course, particularly with Gen AI, it wants to go and reach out to your data. It wants to eat your data. And you've got to be pretty careful about what it's going to find. So we started to deploy, rethink our information governance strategy, our classification of data, deploying some tech that allows us to encourage the business to classify data, which prevents then accidental sharing, for example. So a whole range of stuff there. Okay, return on investment, I'll touch on that quickly. We're finding that quite an issue. Talking to the funding boards about how do we get money for this kind of stuff, because particularly with Gen AI, the benefits are quite hard to describe. And actually, if I go back a slide, the funding approvers, I think it's probably fair to say, are more towards that end of the slide than they are towards that end. So partly my job, I think, is to also to coach and educate some of the more senior people in the organization so they understand instinctively what the value is. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about some of our operational use cases. I've talked a lot about the importance of turn optimization. So we're deploying a whole load of technology, including some AI, around how do we A, monitor turn, and B, optimize it. So using smart vision as many airports are actually, to detect all the different activities that go on in the turn, fuel trucks arriving, baggage trucks arriving, people coming on, jet bridges arriving, using some actual AI, smart vision enabled tech to take the work, take some of the workload away from some of the turn crew, for example, detecting FOD on the apron. Because of this congested airfield problem, we're using an analytics platform to model and predict where our bottlenecks are going to be around the airfield. And quite a nice use case actually with Gen AI, there's a whole lot of data and decision making that happens and is communicated by radio, which actually just gets lost typically. So we started to capture that, use Gen AI to not only transcribe it a bit, but then also categorize it and record the milestones that represents to give us another sort of richer layer on what's going on out on the airfield. And that's been really useful. We talked a lot about resource optimization and dynamic planning. So we're already doing a lot of modeling of passenger flows through security, using that to build models with a machine learning loop to understand, is our deployment of staff actually in security and our security lane allocation, is that delivering low queue times or is it not? Because it only takes passengers to arrive at a slightly unpredictable time and then things go a bit wrong. There's a lot of conversation about assisted screening. Now we've got the new CT screening machines. The images are incredibly rich, but actually that's a bit of a challenge for the human screeners. And we think there's probably a good case to assist the screeners with some AI analysis of that image. And then finally, this platform that we're starting to build, which is trying to take all the kind of operational data around the airport and build a model that allows us to predict what's going to happen this afternoon, tomorrow, next week. And that should help us to improve our performance and capacity. I just put this bit in as well, not strictly operational exactly, but just represents the kind of range of stuff that airports get involved with. So we have an e-commerce platform because we sell car parking spaces, quite a big bit of our revenue actually. But it's also, importantly, the one area where passengers interact directly with the airport system. Most of the interaction, of course, is with an airline usually. So when they buy a car park space, we actually find out something about our passengers, and that potentially allows us then to optimize their journey through the airport, perhaps encourage them to spend a bit more in the departure lounge if we're lucky. So what we're starting to use is AI in our e-commerce platform to, based on the buying patterns that we see on the platform, to start to use that to personalize and to categorize the people that are buying that car parking. We can then target experience at them. And actually having some really interesting conversations with some of our airlines who are very interested in increasing the digital experience of passengers as they go through the airport. And so that using an airline app, essentially, and the ability for us then to overlay what we know about the passenger just really helps to enrich that whole experience. So that's a very live conversation at the moment. So just in summary, I think AI is a bit different. Maybe it's my perspective as a really an IT guy. And it's partly because I think that change in the way that it allows humans to interact with technology seems to me is actually pretty big and pretty fundamental. We've been working on a strategy for a while now, as I say, trying to get the business more bought into using the technology they have available to them, because they're the ones with the problems. Let's reduce the friction between business and technology adoption. And I think AI is a bit of a game changer there, because it just brings a whole load of capability much more directly into the hands of the business. But it's happening quickly. I've used this Dilbert cartoon quite a bit over the years, but this, I think, generative AI in particular is very relevant. It's very quick. It's been very sudden. And I think certainly in a technology function, it's really encouraging us to think a bit differently about how we use this innovation to change the relationship between technology and the business going forward. That's it. Thank you.